Hi everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Anna. Today I have a longer story for you, called The Old Mustang. It's about a young man who inherits something broken, and slowly learns that fixing it means fixing more than just a car. As always, just relax and listen, and let's begin. Jake Sullivan was 24 years old when his grandfather passed away, leaving behind a small house, a modest amount of savings, and, sitting quietly under a dusty tarp in the garage, a 1967 Ford Mustang that hadn't run in over 15 years. Jake's grandfather, Walter, had bought the car brand new as a young man, driven it proudly for decades, and then, after a stroke left him unable to drive safely, simply parked it in the garage and never touched it again, always promising he would fix it up one of these days, a day that never came. At the funeral, Jake's aunt suggested selling the car for scrap, since it clearly needed extensive work and none of the family had any interest in old cars or mechanical repair. But something about that suggestion bothered Jake deeply. He remembered sitting in the passenger seat as a child, his grandfather driving him along the coastal highway with the windows down, music playing, both of them completely happy. The car represented something important, even broken and covered in dust, and Jake couldn't bring himself to let it go so easily. Jake thought often, during the weeks following the funeral, about specific memories connected to the Mustang. He remembered being maybe 7 years old, sitting on his grandfather's lap in the driveway, both hands on the steering wheel while the car sat parked and quiet, his grandfather patiently explaining what each dial and button meant, long before Jake was anywhere near old enough to actually drive. He remembered a particular summer road trip, just the two of them, driving 4 hours to visit the ocean, stopping at a small diner along the way where his grandfather taught him how to order coffee like a grown man, even though Jake was only 12 and the coffee tasted terrible to him at the time. He remembered, most vividly of all, the day his grandfather first let him sit behind the wheel on an empty stretch of country road, gently guiding his nervous, 15-year-old hands through his very first attempt at actually driving. "This car has been part of this family longer than you have," his grandfather had told him that day, laughing warmly. "Someday, you'll understand why I love her so much." At the time, young Jake hadn't fully understood that sentiment. Now, standing in his grandfather's quiet, empty garage, staring at the dusty, broken vehicle his grandfather had once loved so deeply, Jake finally began to understand exactly what his grandfather had meant. "I want to fix it up," Jake announced during a family gathering shortly after the funeral, surprising everyone, including himself. "You don't know anything about cars," his older brother pointed out, not unkindly, just stating an obvious fact. "I know," Jake admitted. "But I want to learn." Jake worked as a graphic designer, a job that kept him comfortably indoors, staring at computer screens, rarely requiring him to use his hands for anything more physical than typing. He had never changed his own oil, never opened an engine hood beyond checking windshield fluid, and certainly never attempted anything close to restoring a 50-year-old vehicle. Despite this complete lack of experience, Jake felt an unexpected determination growing within him, something connected to grief, to memory, and to a genuine desire to honor his grandfather properly. The first weekend after officially deciding to restore the Mustang, Jake pulled the dusty tarp off completely, revealing the car's condition clearly for the first time. The exterior paint had faded significantly, showing patches of rust along the wheel wells and lower doors. 2 tires were completely flat, 1 tire missing entirely. Inside, the leather seats had cracked badly from years of sitting unused, and a thick layer of dust covered every surface. Jake stood staring at the car for a long time, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the scope of the project he had just committed himself to. He had absolutely no idea where to begin. That evening, searching online, Jake discovered a small, old-fashioned auto repair shop not far from his apartment, run by a man named Frank Delgado, who had over 40 years of experience specifically restoring classic American cars. Jake visited the shop the following morning, nervously explaining his situation. Frank, an older man with grease-stained hands and a genuinely kind face, listened carefully to Jake's story, nodding thoughtfully throughout. "A '67 Mustang," Frank said, clearly impressed. "Beautiful car, when it's running right. Your grandfather had good taste." I don't really know where to start, Jake admitted honestly. I've never worked on a car before in my life. Frank studied Jake for a moment, seeming to consider something carefully. Tell you what, he finally said. I don't usually do this, but I like your reason for wanting to fix her up. I'll teach you the basics, guide you through the process, if you're willing to actually put in the work yourself. I won't just fix it for you. You'll be doing the actual labor, under my guidance. Deal? Jake agreed immediately, grateful and slightly nervous about the significant commitment he had just made. Over the following weeks, Jake spent every weekend, and many weekday evenings after work, at Frank's small garage, learning fundamental automotive skills that felt completely foreign initially. Frank started with basics: how the engine worked overall, the function of different major components, how to safely use various tools, and fundamental safety procedures when working underneath a vehicle. The first significant task involved completely removing and inspecting the engine, determining exactly what needed replacement or repair. This process alone took nearly 3 full weekends, Jake's hands becoming permanently stained with grease and oil, his knowledge expanding rapidly under Frank's patient, detailed instruction. Cars aren't complicated once you understand the logic behind them, Frank explained during one particularly frustrating session, when Jake struggled to properly reinstall a stubborn engine component. Everything has a purpose, a reason for being exactly where it is. Once you understand why, the how becomes much easier. Despite Frank's encouragement, Jake experienced considerable frustration during these early weeks. Simple tasks that seemed straightforward when Frank demonstrated them became genuinely difficult when Jake attempted them independently. He stripped a bolt during his second weekend, requiring an entire afternoon to properly remove it. He installed a part backward during his third weekend, not realizing his mistake until Frank pointed it out during a routine check. One particularly memorable failure occurred during his fourth weekend, when Jake, feeling slightly overconfident after a few small successes, decided to attempt removing the carburetor without waiting for Frank's supervision. Within minutes, he had disconnected several small components without properly labeling or remembering their original positions, resulting in a confusing pile of parts scattered across the workbench with no clear idea how they originally fit together. When Frank arrived and discovered the situation, Jake braced himself for a frustrated reaction. Instead, Frank simply laughed, pulled up a stool, and sat down calmly beside the confused pile of parts. "This is actually a good lesson," Frank said, to Jake's surprise. "Every mechanic does this eventually, usually more than once. From now on, take a photo with your phone before disassembling anything complicated. And label everything, always, even when you're absolutely certain you'll remember." Together, they spent nearly 3 hours patiently identifying each component and correctly reassembling the carburetor, Frank explaining the specific function of each small part along the way. Jake left that evening exhausted and slightly embarrassed, but genuinely more knowledgeable than before his mistake. "I'm clearly terrible at this," Jake said one evening, genuinely discouraged after another mistake-filled session. Frank laughed, not unkindly. "Everyone makes these mistakes when they're learning. I made worse ones, believe me, when I was your age starting out. The difference between people who eventually become skilled and people who quit isn't talent, Jake. It's patience, and refusing to let frustration win." Encouraged by Frank's perspective, Jake continued showing up consistently, gradually improving his skills and confidence with each passing week. By the second month, he could complete basic tasks independently, requiring Frank's guidance only for more complex procedures. Around the 5th month, once the engine and transmission were both functioning properly, Jake turned his attention to the car's brake system and electrical wiring, both of which had deteriorated significantly during the vehicle's 15 years of inactivity. Frank explained that faulty brakes represented one of the most dangerous aspects of any restoration, requiring absolute precision and careful double-checking before the car could ever be considered safe to drive. "This isn't a place to rush or cut corners," Frank told him seriously, a noticeably more serious tone than he had used during earlier, less safety-critical lessons. "Everything else on this car, if you make a mistake, you simply fix it later. With brakes, a mistake could genuinely hurt someone. Jake approached the brake system rebuild with heightened caution, replacing worn brake lines, rebuilding the master cylinder, and carefully bleeding air from the entire hydraulic system, a delicate process Frank demonstrated personally before allowing Jake to attempt it independently on the rear brakes. The electrical wiring proved equally challenging, though considerably less dangerous. Decades of exposure to humidity and small rodents had damaged significant portions of the original wiring harness, requiring Jake to methodically trace, test, and often completely replace numerous individual wires throughout the vehicle. This particular task required more patience than physical skill, Jake spending countless evening hours carefully labeling and organizing wires according to diagrams Frank provided from an old factory service manual. Electrical work is basically a giant puzzle, Frank explained. Frustrating sometimes, but genuinely satisfying once everything finally connects correctly. After several additional weeks, Jake successfully completed both critical systems, testing the brakes extensively in Frank's parking lot before feeling confident enough to consider any future road testing. Around this time, Jake also discovered a local classic car enthusiast club that met monthly at a nearby diner, sharing advice, stories, and occasionally spare parts among members restoring similar vintage vehicles. Jake attended his first meeting somewhat nervously, feeling like an obvious beginner among experienced enthusiasts, many of whom had been restoring classic cars for decades. However, the club members welcomed Jake warmly, genuinely excited to hear about his grandfather's Mustang and eager to offer advice and encouragement. An older member named Rosa, who had restored 3 classic cars herself over the years, became particularly helpful, offering practical suggestions and even lending Jake a specialized tool he needed but couldn't afford to purchase himself. "We were all beginners once," Rosa told him during that first meeting. "This community exists exactly for that reason, to help each other through the difficult, confusing early stages." Around this same time, Jake's aunt, the same relative who had originally suggested selling the Mustang for scrap, visited his grandfather's house to collect a few remaining family items. Passing by the garage, she noticed the door open and glanced inside, clearly expecting to see the same rusted, abandoned vehicle from months earlier. Instead, she found Jake carefully cleaning newly rebuilt engine components, the garage considerably more organized than before, with visible progress evident throughout. "I honestly didn't think you'd stick with this," she admitted, standing in the doorway, genuinely surprised by what she saw. "Neither did I, honestly," Jake said, laughing a little. "But I couldn't just let it go. It felt like giving up on him, somehow." His aunt was quiet for a moment, studying the partially restored engine thoughtfully. "Your grandfather used to talk about this car constantly," she said, her voice softening considerably. "I think I forgot how much it actually meant to him, being so caught up in dealing with everything else after he passed. Maybe I was wrong to suggest scrapping it so quickly." "You weren't wrong, exactly," Jake said kindly. "It was a completely reasonable suggestion, given how it looked back then. I just felt like I needed to try." From that conversation onward, Jake's aunt began taking a genuine interest in the restoration's progress, occasionally stopping by to see updates, eventually even contributing a small amount of money toward a particularly expensive part when Jake mentioned the ongoing costs during a family dinner. This unexpected reconciliation, born entirely from the slow, visible progress of the restoration itself, meant almost as much to Jake as the mechanical progress on the car. By the 4th month of restoration work, Jake successfully completed the engine rebuild, a significant milestone requiring considerable skill and patience. However, when Frank helped him attempt to start the engine for the first time since the rebuild, nothing happened. The engine simply refused to turn over, despite everything appearing correctly installed. Jake felt crushed by this disappointment, having anticipated this moment excitedly for weeks. "What did I do wrong?" he asked, genuinely discouraged. Frank spent nearly an hour carefully checking each component, eventually discovering a small, easily overlooked electrical connection that hadn't been properly secured. "This happens constantly during restorations," Frank reassured him. "Small oversights are completely normal, even for experienced mechanics. This is a perfectly fixable problem." After correcting the loose connection, they attempted starting the engine again. This time, after a few tense seconds of grinding, the engine roared to life, filling the garage with noise and a faint smell of gasoline and motor oil. Jake felt an overwhelming rush of emotion, unexpected tears filling his eyes as he listened to the engine his grandfather had once maintained, now running again after 15 silent years. "There she is," Frank said quietly, placing a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder, clearly understanding the emotional significance of this particular moment. However, this success proved short-lived. A week later, while testing the car's transmission by carefully rolling it in and out of the garage under low power, Jake noticed a concerning grinding noise whenever he attempted to shift gears. Frank's expression grew serious as he listened carefully to the sound. "That's not good," Frank admitted. "Sounds like internal transmission damage, possibly from sitting unused for so many years. We'll need to remove it completely and take a proper look inside." This news discouraged Jake considerably, since transmission repair represented an entirely new, unfamiliar mechanical system, and rebuilding one properly required specialized knowledge that even Frank admitted was somewhat outside his usual expertise, mostly focused on engines and bodywork rather than transmissions specifically. Frank made a few phone calls and eventually connected Jake with an old friend of his, a retired transmission specialist named Walter, coincidentally sharing the same name as Jake's grandfather, something Jake found quietly meaningful. Walter agreed to guide Jake through the transmission rebuild process over several additional weekends, teaching him an entirely new set of specialized skills. The transmission rebuild proved considerably more complex than anything Jake had previously attempted, involving dozens of small internal components that needed precise, careful reassembly. Walter's patient, methodical teaching style differed somewhat from Frank's more relaxed approach, but Jake adapted quickly, appreciating the opportunity to learn from a genuine specialist in this particular area. After nearly a month of careful work, the rebuilt transmission was finally ready for testing. This time, when Jake carefully shifted through the gears with the engine running, everything moved smoothly, without any concerning grinding noises. "Perfect," Walter said, genuinely satisfied with the successful repair. "You've got good hands for this kind of work, Jake. Frank mentioned you were a quick learner, and he wasn't exaggerating." With the major mechanical systems now functioning correctly, Frank suggested it was finally time for a proper test drive, something Jake had been anticipating and dreading in equal measure for months. Before attempting it, however, Jake still needed to locate one frustratingly elusive part, the original style distributor cap, a small but essential engine component that had cracked beyond repair during disassembly months earlier, and which the local auto parts stores simply didn't stock for a car this old. Jake spent several evenings searching online classic car forums, eventually connecting with a small, dedicated community of Mustang enthusiasts scattered across the country, many of whom collected and traded rare original parts specifically for this model year. After posting his specific request, Jake received a promising response from a collector in another state who happened to have exactly the correct original part sitting unused in his personal collection, willing to sell it for a reasonable price. "This is honestly the best part of this whole hobby," Frank told him, when Jake excitedly shared the news of finally locating the part. "There's a whole community of people out there, all quietly keeping these old cars alive together, one small part at a time." Once the distributor cap arrived and was properly installed, the moment finally came for the Mustang's first real test drive since sitting silent for 15 years. Frank insisted on accompanying Jake for this significant milestone, both men nervously excited as Jake carefully backed the car out of the garage and onto the quiet residential street outside. Driving slowly at first, Jake felt an overwhelming rush of emotions, the steering wheel beneath his hands the exact same wheel his grandfather had once guided along countless roads decades earlier. As his confidence grew slightly, he carefully accelerated along a quiet stretch of road, the engine responding smoothly and powerfully, exactly as Frank had promised it eventually would. "How does she feel?" Frank asked, watching Jake's face carefully from the passenger seat. "Incredible," Jake said, genuinely overwhelmed. "I honestly don't have better words for it." With the engine successfully running, Jake's attention shifted toward the car's extensive bodywork requirements, repairing rust damage, replacing damaged panels, and eventually repainting the entire exterior. This proved to be an entirely different skill set from the mechanical work he had focused on previously, requiring considerable patience and attention to detail. During this phase, Jake encountered a significant financial challenge. The specific replacement panels needed for the car's rusted wheel wells were expensive, considerably more than Jake had budgeted for this stage of the restoration. Faced with this unexpected cost, Jake seriously considered pausing the project temporarily until he could save sufficient funds. However, Rosa mentioned during a club meeting that she knew of a salvage yard specializing in classic Mustang parts, located about 2 hours outside the city, where Jake might find appropriate used panels at considerably lower cost than purchasing new replacement parts. Jake spent an entire Saturday driving to this salvage yard, searching through numerous rusted, abandoned vehicles until finally discovering 2 Mustangs of similar age, both with wheel well panels in significantly better condition than his own damaged ones. After careful negotiation with the yard's owner, Jake successfully purchased both necessary panels for a fraction of the original replacement cost, feeling genuinely proud of this resourceful solution to an otherwise significant setback. Installing the salvaged panels required considerable additional skill, since they needed careful modification to properly fit Jake's specific vehicle. Frank guided him patiently through this challenging process over several additional weekends, teaching Jake specialized welding and fitting techniques he hadn't previously encountered during the engine restoration process. By the 7th month, the car's bodywork was largely complete, ready for the crucial final painting process. Jake decided, after considerable research and discussion with Frank, to repaint the car in its original factory color, a deep, classic shade of forest green that matched Jake's childhood memories precisely. The painting process itself required renting specialized equipment and finding adequate space, since Frank's small garage wasn't equipped for professional quality automotive painting. Fortunately, another member of the car club, a man named Tony who owned a slightly larger workshop, generously offered his space for this crucial stage of the restoration. Painting proved to be an entirely new challenge, requiring meticulous preparation, patience during multiple coating layers, and careful attention to environmental conditions like temperature and humidity, all factors Jake hadn't previously considered relevant to automotive restoration. Under Tony and Frank's combined guidance, Jake spent nearly 3 full weekends completing this delicate process, carefully sanding between coats, wiping away every trace of dust before each new layer, and waiting patiently through frustratingly long drying periods between sessions. Painting teaches patience like nothing else in this whole process, Tony told him during one particularly tedious sanding session. You can rush the sanding, sure, but the paint will show every single shortcut afterward. No hiding mistakes here. When Jake finally removed the protective covering after the paint had properly cured, revealing the Mustang's newly restored exterior for the first time, he felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. The deep green paint gleamed brilliantly under the workshop lights, transforming the previously rusted, faded vehicle into something genuinely beautiful, closely resembling the car Jake remembered fondly from childhood memories with his grandfather. Your grandfather would be incredibly proud right now, Frank said, genuinely moved himself, having witnessed Jake's remarkable transformation from complete beginner to genuinely capable amateur mechanic over the preceding months. With major bodywork and painting complete, Jake shifted focus toward the interior restoration, replacing the cracked leather seats, repairing the damaged dashboard, and restoring the original radio, which remarkably still functioned properly after Jake carefully cleaned and repaired several minor internal connections. For the leather seat replacement specifically, Frank recommended a small, family-run upholstery shop across town, run by an elderly craftsman named Mr. Petrov, who specialized exclusively in restoring original interiors for classic vehicles. Jake visited the shop nervously, worried about the potentially high cost of custom leather work. Mr. Petrov examined the damaged seats carefully, running his weathered hands along the cracked leather thoughtfully. Original 1967 material, he said, clearly impressed despite the damage. Not many people bother restoring these properly anymore. Most just replace with cheap modern reproductions. Jake explained his grandfather's connection to the car, and Mr. Petrov's expression softened considerably. My own father had a car like this, many years ago, back in the old country, he said. I understand exactly why you're doing this. Over the following 3 weeks, Mr. Petrov carefully restored the original seats, matching the exact leather grain and stitching pattern used by the original factory decades earlier, a level of detailed craftsmanship Jake hadn't previously encountered during his restoration journey. When Jake returned to collect the finished seats, he found himself genuinely moved by the careful, respectful attention Mr. Petrov had given to preserving something so deeply connected to his grandfather's memory. "These aren't just seats anymore," Mr. Petrov told him, gently patting the newly restored leather. "They're history now, properly preserved. Treat them well." During this interior restoration phase, Jake discovered something unexpectedly emotional tucked beneath the driver's seat, an old photograph, faded significantly with age, showing his grandfather standing proudly beside the brand-new Mustang decades earlier, clearly taken shortly after its original purchase. Jake sat quietly on the garage floor for several minutes, simply studying the faded image, noticing small details he had never known before: his grandfather's youthful, confident smile, an unfamiliar street visible faintly in the background, a date handwritten in pencil along the photograph's white border. He called his mother that evening, describing the photograph in detail. She was quiet for a long moment on the phone before explaining that the photograph had been taken on the exact day his grandfather brought the car home for the very first time, a detail she remembered clearly from old family stories told during her own childhood. "He always said that was one of the proudest days of his life," Jake's mother said softly. "Buying that car with money he'd saved for years." Jake carefully preserved this photograph, eventually placing it inside a small protective frame that he mounted discreetly inside the restored glove compartment, ensuring that small, meaningful piece of family history would remain permanently connected to the car itself. By the 9th month, the restoration was nearly complete, requiring only final detailed touches, polishing chrome elements, replacing worn interior trim pieces, and thoroughly testing all mechanical and electrical systems to ensure everything functioned properly and safely. Polishing the extensive chrome trim proved surprisingly time-consuming, involving painstaking hours removing years of accumulated corrosion from the bumpers, door handles, and window frames using specialized polishing compounds Frank recommended. Jake spent nearly 2 entire weekends on this seemingly small detail alone, determined that every visible surface would properly reflect the care invested throughout the entire restoration process. "Chrome work is where a lot of people give up too early," Frank observed, watching Jake carefully working on a particularly stubborn section of bumper. "It's tedious, unglamorous work. But it's exactly the kind of detail that separates a genuinely excellent restoration from just an average one." Around this time, Jake learned about an upcoming regional classic car show, scheduled specifically during the 10th month of his restoration project, attracting classic car enthusiasts from across the entire region. Encouraged enthusiastically by Frank, Rosa, and other club members, Jake decided to register the Mustang for this significant event, despite feeling somewhat nervous about presenting his restoration publicly for the very first time. The final weeks before the car show involved intense, detailed preparation, addressing every remaining small imperfection Jake could identify. Frank, Rosa, and several other club members generously volunteered additional time helping Jake finalize these final details, genuinely invested in seeing his meaningful restoration project succeed. The night before the car show, Jake carefully cleaned the Mustang one final time, reflecting quietly on his incredible 10-month journey, remembering clearly his initial uncertainty and lack of confidence when first removing that dusty tarp all those months earlier. Car show day arrived with clear skies and warm sunshine, ideal conditions for the outdoor exhibition featuring dozens of beautifully restored classic vehicles arranged across a large public park. Jake carefully drove his Mustang to the event, parking it proudly among numerous other impressive classic cars, feeling a complex mixture of pride, nervousness, and profound emotional significance. Arriving early that morning, Jake spent nearly an hour carefully positioning the car exactly where event organizers directed, wiping away invisible dust one final time, arranging a small handwritten card beside the vehicle briefly explaining its restoration history, a detail Rosa had specifically recommended, mentioning that judges and visitors alike always appreciated understanding the personal story behind a restoration, not just admiring the finished mechanical result. As the morning progressed and the park gradually filled with visitors, families, and fellow enthusiasts, Jake watched nervously as a small group of official judges slowly made their way between the rows of vehicles, carefully examining engine bays, checking paint quality under bright portable lights, and occasionally asking owners detailed questions about specific restoration choices. When the judges eventually reached Jake's Mustang, he found himself explaining, somewhat nervously at first, the entire restoration journey: Frank's mentorship, the transmission rebuild, Mr. Petrov's careful upholstery work, and finally, his grandfather's original connection to the vehicle. One judge, an older woman with decades of experience evaluating classic restorations, knelt down to examine the undercarriage closely before standing back up, smiling warmly at Jake. "The mechanical work here is honestly impressive for someone at your experience level," she said. "But it's clear this restoration meant something more personal than just technical achievement. That comes through clearly." Throughout the day, numerous visitors stopped to admire Jake's Mustang, several experienced classic car enthusiasts specifically praising the quality and authenticity of his restoration work, particularly impressed upon learning it represented Jake's very first automotive restoration project. "This is genuinely excellent work for a first restoration," one experienced judge commented, carefully examining the engine bay and overall craftsmanship. "You should be very proud of yourself." Near the end of the day, during the show's awards ceremony, Jake was surprised and deeply moved to hear his name announced, receiving a special recognition award specifically created for outstanding first-time restoration projects, an award Jake hadn't even known existed prior to that moment. Walking forward to accept this unexpected recognition, Jake felt overwhelmed with emotion, thinking immediately of his grandfather, of Frank's patient mentorship, of Rose's generous assistance, and of the entire supportive community that had guided him through this transformative journey. "This award really belongs to my grandfather," Jake told the small crowd during his brief acceptance speech, his voice slightly unsteady with genuine emotion. "This car was his pride and joy for decades. I just wanted to bring it back to life, to honor what it meant to him, and honestly, to him and me both." After the ceremony concluded, Frank approached Jake, genuinely proud and visibly moved himself. "I've mentored plenty of beginners over the years," Frank said, "but few have shown the dedication and heart you've demonstrated throughout this entire process, Jake. Your grandfather truly would be incredibly proud." In the months following the car show, Jake continued driving his beautifully restored Mustang regularly, no longer treating it as merely a static restoration project but genuinely enjoying it as his primary vehicle whenever weather permitted. He maintained his close friendship with Frank, Rosa, and other members of the Classic Car Club, regularly attending meetings and occasionally assisting other beginning enthusiasts starting their own restoration journeys, much as Frank had generously assisted him. Eventually, nearly a year after completing his grandfather's Mustang, Jake found himself mentoring a nervous young woman named Sophia, who had recently inherited her own broken classic car from a deceased relative and had no idea where to begin. Recognizing his own initial uncertainty reflected clearly in Sophia's nervous questions, Jake patiently guided her through fundamental automotive concepts, exactly as Frank had once patiently guided him. Sophia had inherited a 1972 Chevrolet Camaro from her uncle, a car in even worse mechanical condition than Jake's Mustang had originally been, missing several major components entirely. Jake introduced her to Frank's garage, to the monthly car club meetings, and even to Mr. Petrov's upholstery shop when Sophia eventually reached that stage of her own restoration months later. "I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing," Sophia admitted nervously during their first meeting at Frank's garage, almost word for word echoing Jake's own nervous confession from nearly 2 years earlier. "Neither did I, when I started," Jake told her honestly, smiling at the familiar feeling of watching someone else begin exactly the journey he himself had once found so overwhelming. "You'll be surprised how quickly that changes, if you keep showing up. Everyone starts exactly where you're standing right now," Jake told her reassuringly, echoing Frank's own words from over a year earlier. "The difference between people who eventually succeed and those who don't isn't natural talent. It's simply patience, and refusing to let frustration convince you to quit." One quiet Sunday afternoon, about a year after completing the restoration, Jake drove the Mustang out to the cemetery where his grandfather was buried, parking carefully nearby before walking over to sit beside the simple headstone for a while. He told his grandfather quietly about everything that had happened since the funeral: Frank's patient mentorship, the frustrating early mistakes, the transmission problem, Mr. Petrov's careful upholstery work, the car show award, and his aunt's unexpected reconciliation. "I finally understand what you meant, about why you loved her so much," Jake said quietly, looking back toward the gleaming green Mustang parked nearby. "It was never really about the car, was it? It was about everything the car represented. I get that now." Afterward, Jake drove directly from the cemetery toward the coastal highway, the same road he remembered so vividly from childhood, windows down, warm ocean air filling the car exactly as it had decades earlier during those cherished rides with his grandfather. He stopped briefly at the same small diner from his childhood road trip memory, half expecting the coffee to still taste terrible, and smiling to himself when it genuinely did. Driving home along the coast as the sun began setting, the restored engine humming steadily beneath him, Jake felt a deep, settled sense of peace he hadn't fully experienced since before his grandfather's passing. The car, once broken and forgotten beneath a dusty tarp, now carried forward not just an old family memory, but an entirely new chapter of Jake's own life, one built through patience, mentorship, community, and genuine love. Reflecting occasionally on his remarkable journey, Jake realized that restoring his grandfather's Mustang had ultimately given him far more than simply a beautifully functioning classic car. It had taught him genuine patience, meaningful new skills, valuable new friendships, and perhaps most importantly, a profound, lasting connection to his grandfather's memory that Jake would treasure for the rest of his life. And that's the end of today's story, The Old Mustang. I really love this story because it shows something meaningful. Sometimes, the things we inherit, whether broken cars or difficult circumstances, become opportunities for genuine personal growth, if we're brave enough to attempt fixing them ourselves, with patience and the right support around us. Before you go, think about this: has someone ever taught you a skill patiently, the way Frank taught Jake? Did you ever pass that same patience along to someone else afterward? Thank you so much for listening today. This has been Anna, and this is the podcast. See you in the next episode. Take care, and keep practicing your English.